Hello, everyone, and welcome to Season 4, Episode 2 of Energy versus Climate. My name is Ed Whittingham, and as always, I'm joined by my webinar co-hosts, Sara Hastings-Simon and David Keith. The human cost of Russia's invasion of Ukraine is, of course, tragic, and it's something that we've talked about previously on this show. The invasion has also created huge fallout in European and global energy markets. Countries like Germany that were dependent on Russian gas imports in their energy mix are now facing rising prices for energy and possible fuel shortages as winter nears. So, how did Europe become so reliant on Russian gas? And what will Germany and the rest of Europe do to make it through this winter? How will the war impact energy transition and emission levels in Europe in the short and medium term? And what does all this mean for global energy developers and exporters, including those here in Canada? So today on EVC, we're talking war versus climate. And to help us, we've enlisted Dr. Gernot Wagner of Columbia University. So Gernot is a climate economist at Columbia's Business School, where his research, writing, and teaching all focus on climate risks and climate policy. He writes a monthly column for Project Syndicate, and he has authored or co-authored 4 books, including Geoengineering the Gamble, Stadt, Land, Klima. Apologies for my bad German pronunciation. It's also City, Country, Climate in German, Climate Shock, and But Will the Planet Notice? And prior to joining Columbia as a senior lecturer, Gernot taught at New York University and Harvard, and he has been a term member of the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations. He's joining us today from New York City. Welcome, Gernot.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Okay, the format for today's show. We're going to start with a primer on the war and its impacts on Europe with Gernot. Then I will guide us through some questions, as I normally do, until roughly 45 minutes after the hour. And after that, we'll have 15 minutes for Q&A with you, the audience. And to do that, feel free to send in your questions via the Q&A box throughout the webinar, and thanks for not using the raise hand function or the chat box. Okay, let's get to it. So let's start with the big question, Gernot. How did we get here, or how did Europe get into the situation it's in right now in being so reliant on Russian natural gas?
Just to be clear, and I guess, it doesn't even have to be restated, but really how we got here is Putin blew a fuse, right? We wouldn't be talking if February 24th, the invasion hadn't happened, right? Now, even that, to bring it right back to climate, right, could be because of what some might call the green paradox of sorts, right? The sort of thing where if oil and gas are on their way out, now is the time, right, to use sort of the height of the power, Russia's perspective, right? 1/10 of all oil, largest gas reserves on the planet, largest gas exporter, mainly to Europe, right? And he lost it, right? Essentially, there are semi-rational explanations for what's really going on, but at the end of the day, no idea what happens even between us speaking right now, right? And you, dear listener, listening to this, right? So we are talking about tactical nukes being used, right? Is that in Ukraine? Are we talking about somewhere else in Europe? And so on and so forth, right? So risks and uncertainties just dominate all of this. Okay, now, just to be clear, right, back to your question, how do we really get here, right? How do we get so dependent? Complacency, right? Let's start with that. Wishful thinking, and frankly, putting my economist hat on, in this battle of efficiency, cost effectiveness, right? Cheap gas especially, and reliability, resiliency, redundancy, sustainability, whatever you want to call it. Cheap gas won. Cheap energy won. Businesses, of course, are looking for the cheapest possible energy source. And, especially if you let them, privatize the profits, socialize the costs. That's essentially what's been happening, not just on climate, geopolitical risks, of course, as well. They will, right? Austria's national oil company, or the large Austrian national oil company, literally sponsors Putin's favorite soccer team, St. Petersburg, right? Like it's sort of this sort of stuff where you are, some of it is laughable, of course, and some of it is essentially sort of the raw, day-to-day. I don't want to call it economics, sort of in the academic sense, right? Of let's maximize welfare for the most people. No, it's just raw business transactions where, the states, nations, Europe, right, have basically been enablers of a lot of that. Part of this, you might also say, is, Europe's sort of too rich for its own good. Right? There's the Groningen oil gas field in the Netherlands, largest gas field in the Netherlands. Like, the Dutch basically decided, no, not worth it anymore. We are no longer going to extract our own gas, right? We can afford to import it and sort of leave these natural resources, if you will, untapped. Because, of course, there are sort of problems associated with the pollution problems and so on, and earthquakes in that province, Groningen, and because of local politics for the most part, dependency on Russian gas increased dramatically.
And Groningen, that's a great example of NIMBYism. And I, when I was an advisor to Shell Global, we talked about that issue a lot, and so the listeners and viewers understand. Yep. When you have microseismic activity in the Netherlands, in the backyard of where Shell is located, the decision was, we don't want that. We don't want our coffee cups rattling. We'd rather someone else deal with that and just pay for energy. But let's talk about, we're talked about cheap natural gas, and we've had cheap natural gas prices for a long time until recently, of course. But let's, I guess, fill out the energy mix. What about oil? Russian oil exports, and does Russia, export any electricity, say, through nuclear power? Is that in the mix too?
So great question, right? So I guess, okay, let me start with, there's two very different stories here, gas and oil, right? So on oil, the EU is not all that different from the rest of the world. So yes, there's this one German refinery that has the direct pipeline from Russia instead of, 100% dependent on Russian oil. But on the whole, oil is a global market. 10% of US imports, for example, used to be Russian oil. Well, 30% of the EU's oil imports are from Russia. And overall, yes, Russia extracts around 1/10 of oil used globally, right? So 10 million barrels a day come from Russia, 100 million-ish barrels total global. On gas, the story is very different. So, the US basically gets essentially zero gas from Russia, right? And Canada and sort of the rest of the world is much, much less dependent than the EU, which gets 1/3 of its total energy overall, EU-wide, from burning gas. 40% of the gas comes from Russia via pipelines, or I should say, came from Russia via pipelines, right, before the current mess. And okay, so what is the gas being used? Not all of it is for electricity, of course. It's sort of the rule of thumb is sort of 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. 1/3 is electricity. 1/3 is for heating, home heating, sort of district heating. 1/3 is industry. And there too, of course, are huge regional differences, right, within Europe. So Italy is famously dependent on gas, hugely dependent on gas. So East European countries, Hungary, vastly dependent. Like Italy, I think is like 40%, over 40% of Italian energy, total energy, is gas, most of it from Russia. Some other countries, sort of the other extreme, Iceland, 0%. So they burn oil for transport, but no gas or oil for electricity. It's hydro and geothermal. And when you look at Icelandic electricity prices right about now, right, none of the craziness that happens in Europe right now happening on that particular island because they're wholly independent. But here's sort of the trick, right? Now, most countries, of course, are somewhere in between. Germany, sort of as the biggest one, has a large dependency on Russian gas. Not to always talk about Austria, that's where my accent is from, but actually Austria's example is instructive here. So 60% of its electricity is hydro, right? Happenstance, geography, and so on. 10% solar and mostly wind, renewables. 10% is biomass, depending on the definition, right? Also renewable energy. So 80% is something other than gas. Well, 20% is in fact gas, and 80% of that gas comes from Russia. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's where the economics kicks in, right? So unless you are Iceland, unless you're basically wholly independent, you're literally cut off from Russian gas, it basically doesn't matter how much of your electricity comes from anything else. If Russian gas right now is the most expensive way, the most volatile, fickle part of your electricity production, basically, well, it sets the price for everything, right? Yep. If there's one plant left that still burns gas, that plant sets the electricity price for everyone, which sort of usually, right, isn't such bad news for renewables, for example. You're basically printing money, right? But of course, that fun ends when electricity prices don't just double or increase, slightly, making you a bit more profit, but, quadruple, increase tenfold, right? Starts to be much less funny, of course.
For sure. And just to interject. Yeah, Vladimir Putin is clearly willing to use energy as a political pawn, to cut off the taps, to allegedly blow up underwater gas pipelines. Who knows? Yep. So if you're, say, Olaf Scholz in Germany, or you're part of the new, right of center government in Italy, you're looking at the winter, what can you do to make it through? How do you ensure that your residents, your country people are not going to freeze in the dark this winter because of this war?
So it turns out, this winter, it's going to be hard and so on and so forth. Surprisingly, probably not as hard as the following winter, assuming, the problem doesn't go away in itself, its war ends. Largely because Europe has been pretty darn good filling its gas reserves, like 90% or so at this point, which is much more so than happened in prior years. Also complacency back then, but still, right, to your question, so what can you do? Well, one thing, of course, is to look for alternative sources, and that has happened. Right, LNG, liquid natural gas, is basically maxed out. So Germany, for example, is building 3 new LNG terminals. They're not ready yet. All the other ones, basically at their max. LNG imports increased like 50%. So earlier this spring, this is now from April of this year, 50% more imports than a year prior, plus 20% from the month from March 2022, right? Sort of massive increases, rapid increases, and at capacity. And of course, right, the closer you look, of course, the more complicated it gets. So lots of these terminals happen to be on the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, Portugal. Very little capacity between Spain, Portugal, and the rest of Europe to then basically get the gas to the rest of Europe, right? So there's sort of now inequality within Europe, right, where the Spaniards are looking a lot better in terms of their gas storage than, let's say, Germany. Another big part, of course, here is the sort of policies that countries have been instituting all along. And frankly, there too, opinions differ strongly, of course, I can tell you. But I would say there have been a lot of missed opportunities within Europe since February 24th, where we basically, very early on, simply, basically didn't take this moment and say, we've got to conserve gas now. This is not a next winter problem. Right now is the time to start saving in order to get ready for the following heating season and maybe even the year after.
Sure. And I wanted to actually pick up on those policies and mistakes, but just to bring it back here, the common refrain that we hear here in Canada and North America generally, and especially from folks in the oil and gas industry, is this is a cautionary tale that, led by Germany, Europe tried to decarbonize its economy, decarbonize electricity. In the end, and paradoxically, just made itself more dependent on these exports, or rather imports, of Russian gas. It's a cautionary tale. Let's maintain energy security here and continue to develop our fossil fuel assets. This is going to be a theme, I'm sure, during our conversation today. What's your opinion? And then I want to bring in David and Sara.
Okay, so I would say I would be very careful with sort of a blanket statement like this, right? So, like I said, right, like if you're like volatility matters, let's put it that way, right? Like if anything, volatility dwarfs all here, right? So yeah, the less you import, or the less, the less dependent you are on fossil fuels, the more the remaining volatility of those fossil fuel prices matters, and the more volatile things are going to be. So you could argue, right, this is sort of the birthing woes, if you will. I would be careful with a blanket statement, because frankly, the opposite holds true too, right? Had we gone faster, I'm going to say we, right, Europe, decarbonizing, we will be less dependent, right? So if anything, it's the balance, right? It's basically, how do you weigh the transition from, now, just to be clear, right? Like, happy to make one very definitive statement here. Germany phasing out nuclear before phasing out coal, or for that matter, fossil fuels in general, of course, yes, a big mistake, as we see right now. So no, not everything positive, not everything going swimmingly, but if anything, right, this shows us the Energiewende, the German energy transition, going even faster, right? Having 20,000 extra wind turbines sitting around right about now would save quite a bit of gas and quite a bit of pain.
Got you. Okay, Sara, let's turn to you. So, we'll have a debate whether, the naysayers versus those who say, well, energy transition, we need to go harder and faster. How do you think this war and the energy crisis associated with it, how is it going to impact energy transition and even extend to emission levels in Europe in the short, medium term? I know you've been following this.
Yeah, so I feel like I always have the same answer on the show, which is like a little bit in both directions. I think that there's a couple of factors that will drive things. So obviously, I do think that we're seeing an acceleration of deployment of, new renewable energy facilities, building wind and solar, exactly because, you have this gap to make up with gas, and the faster that you can get that stuff built, the faster that gap goes away. Similarly, a big push to install heat pumps more quickly in homes across Europe. Anecdotally, the little village that my husband is from in Austria actually has a heat pump manufacturer, and they are hiring quite a lot of people over this next period. So there seems to be a real push there. There's obviously, though, a limit to how fast that can go. Although I do think that, for all of the challenges of comparing this to, say, the oil crisis of the 70s, if you look at what happened in the US, there was a big push around the idea of energy independence through an increased reliance on renewable energy. And so I think there is, I see fingerprints of something similar that I think will happen. there are a couple of things that could go in the other direction that I think, we do start to see in the very, very short term. Of course, the kind of all hands on deck for any other kind of power generation, and the increase in coal fired power, for example, is something that in the very short term, I think, can drive emissions up. But, there's in a crisis, there's not much else you can do. One of the other areas in the short term that I think can be concerning is the use of the way that policies that are designed to help people with the burden of high energy costs, those that really can't afford it, can risk to create the wrong kinds of incentives. So, obviously, when energy costs being very high, things need to be done to protect, in particular, low and middle income consumers for whom, that burden becomes really problematic. But when those policies come in the form, for example, of a direct reduction in price for heating oil or for electricity, we've even seen that here in Alberta with the implementation of a reduction in our gasoline tax. That is sort of the worst way if you want to do that, as opposed to giving kind of flat rebates. And it's bad. I think also there's a risk that it can end up sticking around, because once you have, nobody wants to be the one to raise a tax and raise the price. So even though it's, in principle, it's not raising it, it's going back to what it was before. It plays out like it's being raised. And you see that conversation actually happening in Alberta right now as the tax has come, the tax deduction on gasoline has gone down slightly, and there's been a lot of noise from the opposition party in Alberta saying, no, we shouldn't do that. So that's one I think to watch. The one though to me that's more concerning is, to what extent do we end up locking in higher carbon solutions? And I think we're going to come to this when we start talking about LNG. But if you have, say, a 10-year gap or a 5-year gap, or some time frame that is quite small on the lifetime of LNG infrastructure, for which it could be useful and even in some cases an emissions reduction opportunity. The problem is that once these things are built, they don't tend to go away. And so are we, building them with a plan for that transition later, or are we building them and we're going to end up in the same position, coming back to the very, very beginning of this story and the idea that, at one point, Reagan actually was, pushing very hard against the construction of this pipeline, right? And this gas pipeline. The U.S. president at the time, Ronald Reagan, didn't want to see Europe become dependent on gas from the Soviet Union, and he was ultimately overruled. Partially, there's an interesting New York Times article on this, partially by the oil and gas companies that wanted the U.S. oil and gas companies that wanted to go and develop that Russian oil and gas, and you saw then in 2014 with the Russians' annexation of Crimea and the Obama administration wanting to impose sanctions, that then once again the oil and gas companies, including the multinationals and the U.S. companies that were involved there, were pushing back on that, right? So once these things get built, once these infrastructures get built, once these projects are developed, the oil and gas production, there's a lot of pressure to keep them in place. And so to me, that's the biggest risk that we see around what's going on, slowing down a transition.
Cool. Let's go to you, David. So what do you see as the risks? Look into your crystal ball, and what are the implications? You've talked about this of high prices associated with the war, and is it actually going to spur transition, or is it going to spur revolts by these populations, and ultimately the kind of fighting a market distortion with another market distortion activity that we've seen here in Canada?
I'd like to come back to that in a minute, if you don't mind, and instead hit some more techie questions that I don't know if Gernot will know, but they interest me. One is oil to gas. So at least in the old days, natural gas power plants, many of them were able to switch oil to gas in the old days. Some gas turbines are able to operate with oil. And I wonder why there wasn't a bigger push for that in the short run. Obviously, in the long run, oil prices have been higher than gas. So if you're a generator in the normal world, it made sense to be in gas, not oil. But oil is easy to transport and store. And in terms of managing this disruption, Gernot, did you see anything about oil to gas repowering to manage the peak?
Very, very little. And frankly, oil prices are not, relatively speaking, as high as gas prices, but they too, right, increased dramatically.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I think I think it's probably because of the economics, right, and the relative economics. So yeah, short answer is very little.
Yeah, and the other one was about LNG import, the utilization of regasification. So one of my big surprises in this is it turns out that prior to the war, I've looked it up, it looks like the overall European utilization of regas was only like 40%. So it's basically a bunch of excess capacity there. And even my understanding is in 2022, it's only been at like 70% Europe-wide, but I'm sure you're right that a bunch of places are maxed out. And this is where I think I just love to understand more about, maybe a really big question is, in the very old days, pre-war, pre-World War II, oil was mostly sold in kind of a point-to-point market. And then we got this really global liquid market where people literally trade on tankers in the middle of the ocean and they decide where they're going. And LNG, all the early LNG was point-to-point deals, long-term contracts, and now it's becoming more fluid. And I think one of my big questions sort of related to the LNG gasification question is, will this war be the thing that kind of pushes the LNG market to look more like the oil market looks, more like a real fluid global market?
So there's certainly some of this happening already, right? So, this is where the Canada angle, of course, comes into, right? Gas to Europe, right? And yes, except, right? And frankly, this is we had no idea, right? Regime change in Russia and suddenly pipelines are, right? No idea, right?
Well, let me hit you on that actually, because there was a question in our feed on that one. I'd like to hear your opinion that a listener wanted to ask you. Okay. So let's assume there is regime change in Russia and the regime is, looks better. Sure. Do you really think the gas pipelines just open up again? I think my guess is not so much, but I don't know. Want to hear your guess?
Okay, just to be clear, this is a full-on guess, right?
Of course.
I don't know. Yeah. Yes. Well, because of the economic, right? Like if you pay 10 times as, right? This is not sort of a 10% increase and you fiddle at the margins and you because you've just signed a contract with the Qataris. Now you're locked in some other contract. So you don't want to break the business relationship and so on, right? No, we are talking about, 5 times, 10x, right? In terms of cost.
Agreed. And just to agree with you, to switch my position
in Germany, right? That are like they are going under as we speak, right? Because it just doesn't pay, right?
Yeah, to switch my position and agree with you more, there's another factor I thought of, which is let's assume there's a post-Putin government in Russia, and Europe wants to show that government, give it a fig leaf to help support it and strengthen it versus let's assume that Russia has a division between the Nazis and the non-Nazis, to be crude. And there's a post-Putin Russia, but that's not so strong. The idea that you give it some money from allowing it to export gas might be a political fig leaf that Europe would want to give, as well as the reason you said, which is wanting cheap gas.
Yeah. Well, and yes, right. And I think now, yes, right. And then it goes both ways. And just to be clear, right, this is not so much allowing Russia to export, because in some sense, right, Europe is clamoring for that gas, right?
Yeah, of course.
This is sort of one of the amazing things, right? Like we are sending what 100 billion, million, right, a day, right, to Russia, right? Like there's sort of vast amounts of, even now, right, despite the sanctions, because we want the gas, and then it's Gazprom, oops, we can't deliver, right? Now, all of that is politics right now from the Russian side. Right. So presumably once we want to, in fact, continue the relationship. Now, Europe will be much more cautious, of course, too. Right. That said, pipeline gas is the cheapest gas and driven by economics.
Yeah. I will say, in any time we're talking about regime change, as appealing as that may be to us who are no fans of Putin, to use the old expression, rumors of my death are greatly exaggerated. We can't forget just how popular, and everything filtered through biased media, but how still popular the war is in Russia, although I think it's clear that popularity is eroding slowly. But since we're on the topic, this war and how it supports the Russian economy, let's just quickly talk about the idea of imposing a price cap on Russian oil exports, because it's one thing, we can sort of starve them and try to get off gas and starve that part of the economy. But there are other countries that are only too willing on the oil side, even if, big economies like the US have said no more Russian oil, that are only too willing to pick up that slack. And that really is it's filling the coffers of Russia and arguably paying for the war. So, Gernot, just, you're there in New York City. It's an American-led issue. Will it happen? And how would that work? And would that really then start to handicap Putin and his war effort?
If it worked, it would, right? I think that's the short version is, if we could make that work, yes, because frankly, we are financing both sides of this war, right? Lots and lots of sanctions, not on energy, right? Not on oil and gas, especially. Sorry, I got the number wrong before, right? It's like €1 billion or so a day that are still going to Russia, right? Financing both sides of the war, right? So if it worked, it would. Can it work? Okay, so actually, I have it pretty easy sitting here in the US, right? So, we don't care. Right? I mean, yes, we care about the effect on global oil price, but 10% of our imports came from Russia, right? Very little direct physical effect. And actually, that's a key bit here too, right? It's one thing to talk economics and prices. It's another, right? Like if you literally are running, the market breaks apart, right? Breaks down if there is no physical quantity, right? Like you jack up the price however high you want, and there is no market reaction because there is no supply, right? That's on the gas side, right? We see that. So on the oil price cap or gas price cap for that matter, right? How do you make this work? Well, now we are talking major, leakage, right? Unless you have the entire globe get together, which of course we don't. I mean, literally, right? Yesterday, OPEC plus, right? Plus Russia was meeting in Vienna, right? All the shady stuff goes down in Vienna, apparently, right? And trying to figure out what was it, 2 million barrels a day, right? Decrease in production, OPEC plus production, right? And a direct response, presumably, to oil price cap conversations. Actually, that's how it was presented, more or less, right? We are doing this because you're talking about oil price cap. We will show you, we can jack up prices all, by ourselves. Thank you very much. So I would say, I would counter all of this with saying, right, if it could work, then yes, we could have a debate about what the effect would be. It's very hard to see how it will, in fact, work.
Got you. So my conclusion is you can have the U.S. say no more imports of Russian oil. And as you said, that's a material hit to the U.S. economy. That is, you can draw a direct line between that decision and raising gas prices, much to the chagrin of Americans heading into midterm elections, even though there is bipartisan support for it. The price cap mechanism, it depends how it's designed, how it's priced. And it's really, if it's toothless, if there are no punitive measures like secondary sanctions on the Chinas and Indias of the world, ultimately it's going to be meaningless. That's my sense of it. But I do want to bring us, we got so many things we can talk about today. This is a hard conversation to manage, but let's talk about the implications for demand for Canadian energy in Europe. That will get back to this LNG question. That there's a sense, I will say, and having spent some time with Canadian oil and gas executives recently, there's a sense of vindication. And by vindication, they feel that they've been, had this disproportionate gaze on them. They've been made out to be the baddies in, any kind of COP discussion, and unfairly targeted compared to other parts of heavy industry. And now suddenly there's an energy crisis and they say, see, you need our energy products. And I will say, I sat in a room with the American and the author and the politician, Michael Schellenberger, who told a room of Canadian energy executives that literally you're the most important people in the world right now because your energy will save Europeans from freezing to death in the dark. And frankly, the audience loved it. And I can understand because the audience.
I mean, of course they would, yes.
Yeah, of course. It was like red meat to the masses. But
Sure.
but now there's this real push. Well, we have to save those Europeans who are at risk of freezing in the dark, that we need to get our energy exports and particularly our LNG to Europe, no matter how difficult that may be. Just like it's very still difficult to get Canadian LNG to East Asian ports. What are the prospects of whether it's US LNG or Canadian LNG or other energy actually providing that kind of stopgap, and particularly in the next winter or two when the crisis is still being really felt? So I'm putting that to you, Gernot, first.
Okay, let me start as the non-Canadian. Let me start. So, so there's a couple of things here where lots of uncertainties, but I think there's a couple of things we do know. So if or since current LNG import capacity in Europe is more or less maxed out, right? Okay, so hypothetical, right? Canada exports 10 times as much, right? Suddenly, overnight. Where is it going to go? I mean, just to be clear, right? Not a global market quite yet, right? Lots of bilateral contracts, but sure, given that globally, right, Europe is trying to gulp up LNG from anywhere it can get, right? So suddenly there are others, of course, who would then buy the Canadian, or for that matter, right, Europe would look to Canada as opposed to the Qataris, right? So sure, there is a lot of opportunity, if you will, as long as gas prices are as high as they are and Europe is essentially willing to pay whatever it takes. Sure, right? But the physical import capacity constraints, and yes, Germany is building 3 new terminals and they're going to come online and, if everything works and super fast, right, 18 months, 2 years, 3 years, right? And yeah, sure. That said, everything depends on what happens to prices, right? Everything depends on what happens to, Russia realizing, regime change or not, right? Come spring, Russia realizes that, wait, we actually do need to finance our war somehow. And Europe, despite everything else and despite the sanctions on, frankly, anything else other than oil and gas, is willing to still buy our gas and send us the €1 billion a day. Thank you very much. Yeah, we'll take that, right? And that's all it takes, right? So again, Nord Stream 1, right? Like whoever sabotaged this particular pipeline or who was responsible, right? Gas could flow through that pipeline or through the other pipelines currently shut off. And then, right, Canada has built all these LNG export terminals and is sitting on the relatively expensive gas, and Europe at least wouldn't want it, right? So I would be slightly less optimistic here than the red meat throwing person you described before.
Fair enough. And Sara, so what's your level of optimism? You sit in the center of it, the University of Calgary. What are your thoughts and what are you hearing?
So I hear two parts of this conversation, right? One is sort of what should we do as Canada going forward, or what should we do now? There is a lot of also conversation about, well, see, this, what we have done previously is all wrong. And if only we had built this stuff, if only we had built these LNG export terminals, we would be in a better place than we are now. And so therefore, I guess the therefore doesn't quite get stated, but in my mind, it's sort of like, therefore we should, just go ahead with fossil fuel expansion in the future rather than what we did, which was not build those LNG terminals. So I want to touch on that one just for a second, in terms of like, well, what if we could go back in time? I think the first point is that there is an LNG terminal that's approved that just hasn't been built, right? So the idea that Canada hasn't taken advantage or hasn't moved forward on building out LNG to date because of, the big bad federal government or the big bad provincial government in BC, maybe the scale or the size of the approved terminals would be larger if there was a different approach there, but still one terminal that could have been built wasn't built. So I think that's the one that's important to remember. Then if you go through sort of this thought exercise of like, well, if we had built it, what would have happened at that time? I think there, prior to last February, there would have been, and Gernot, correct me if I'm wrong, but there would have been, basically no interest in Europe to take any of this LNG, right? They were, as you said, the whole reason that they became dependent on Russian gas was because that was the cheapest option. And so, we might have seen some of that LNG enter into long-term contracts with Asia. And so I think there's even a question mark of, how much additional capacity would we have in this world that was uncontracted and somehow able to, to put it quite crudely, cash in on, the sort of economic opportunity that's been created by this, horrific human tragedy of the war. So I think even that, even if we had done all these things, where we would be is not clear to me. So then the question of, what do we do going forwards? The price challenge and this question of how long prices stay high, and can you really make the economics of building 30, 40, 50-year LNG export terminals work on the basis of a 5 to 10-year sort of gap in natural gas. I think if you're going to do that, if Canada decides to move forward and do that, it very much has to be done not in sort of the usual way that we would build these export terminals, where it's very much more left to the market and it's going to have that lifetime, but instead very much under that constraint where we say, well, maybe there is actually a role in the short term to do this, but how do we set up the permitting for those export terminals to actually have a firm end date? And, if there is enough money in it because prices are high, and so you actually could pay for, you could build the terminal and have it run for a much shorter period of time and recover its cost in those times, how do you make sure that the cost in that short time actually goes to covering the costs and then enables that terminal to be shut down? So the extent to which we're having a conversation now about Canada building up an LNG export, I think it very much needs to be in quite different terms and importantly in that sort of time shortened horizon. And I haven't really seen that happening, although maybe I'm just not listening to the right people.
So I'd like to tackle sort of one more dimension of this, and then we'll get to your questions. And that is, what are the broader, the global implications of the war on emissions, on climate targets? And we can say this in the context of COP27. We saw when the war first happened, I think it was, Gernot, you mentioned February 24th, 2022, and shortly thereafter, President Biden scrubbed references to climate in his State of the Union address. We saw all sorts of things being rewritten. And my concern is COP27 and the importance of those discussions will continue to be overshadowed by the war and just won't get the airtime that it properly deserves. David, what's your take on it, both in the near term and then perhaps in the longer term?
Maybe I'm sorry, Ed, I'm not being as an obedient co-host as I should be, but I think I want to come back to that other question you asked me earlier, which is this real question about tax revolts. I mean, a really simple way to say it, Gernot, and I got some of this from Megan O'Sullivan, is, all else equal, if prices for fossil fuels are higher, that should be a benefit for climate because it's the same as a carbon tax. So if that was all there was in the economic world, why would we be having this discussion of war versus climate, since it would clearly be a benefit to climate to have higher carbon prices? I think the reason why it isn't black and white, the reason why it might not be such a benefit to climate to have higher carbon prices, clearly is something about a kind of tax revolt phenomena, where the combination of these high prices with already higher prices that some industries in Europe faced because of the energy transition, that those things cause individuals, political parties, et cetera, to say, I just can't take any more of these high prices. I want to push back on all this stuff, including the energy transition. So talk to me about that trade-off.
It is a real trade-off, right? I mean, to be clear, right? And I guess, so here's another dimension to this. The whole point of using tax policy or any sort of policy to jumpstart this transition is to not have a permanent policy angle, because the whole point of jumpstarting is that then, eventually it'll go automatically, right? But you have some sort of certainty, right? You basically know that, we'll have a carbon price, implicit or explicit tax or whatever else, right? And that'll go up over time and it'll, increasingly force us to do certain things that otherwise wouldn't have happened. Everybody understands that what is happening right now is temporary, right? Or at least we think we understand that that's that's the case. Now, actually, that said, and not to always talk about Austria, but Austria on October 1st, like 5 days ago, started its first, like 30 years in the making, Austria now has a carbon tax. 30 euros per ton of CO2. Is it, high enough? No. But it's sort of, the best design thing you could imagine. It's like, tax at the margin, lump sum check back to everybody and so on, right? Like, and in the middle of all of this, Austria instituted a carbon tax. To be clear, it was actually delayed. The negotiations were finalized a year ago, 1st October weekend last year. It was supposed to happen over the summer, didn't happen now, October 1st. But still, it did.
Good for those Austrians. Hope you helped to make it happen.
I mean, there's 8 million of us, right? But right, cool, right? Now, okay, back to your question, Ed. Maybe it's sort of what are the broader implications for climate policy? I would say, the only thing that matters here is the trajectory, and not just in this context, but in general, right? What emissions are this year doesn't matter. I mean, the fact that emissions went down in April 2020 because of the COVID lockdowns, 20%, right? Oh my God, wow, right? And you have all these think pieces being written about what COVID means for the climate because of these immediate emissions reductions. So first of all, that's bad news, right? The fact that emissions only, the fact that we all went back to our caves and emissions only went down 20% actually shows us how difficult it is, right? Not, oh my God, hey, we can do this. Look, all it takes is global lockdowns, right? So bad news in that sense. But really, none of this is about instantaneous or current emissions reductions or increases, right? The fact that there's a coal plant now running for longer in Germany or in Austria or wherever, right? Because nobody cares that emissions went up by 10 million tons CO2 for a few months, right? It's about the trajectory. And there, actually, okay, maybe I'm too much of an economist, but you can actually look at what the market thinks is going to happen. And when you look at, there's a group at the University of Zurich who analyzed this, clean energy stocks in Europe went up days after the invasion. Why would that happen? Well, because of expectations that this jumpstarts the transition. And actually, at the time, this analysis came out in May of this year, the first version, there was this real transatlantic divergence. In the Americas, none of that happened. Whereas in Europe, you saw the jump, right? So the expectation that European policy will move in that direction, that heat pump manufacturer in Sarah's husband's hometown in Austria is running at max capacity for good reason, right? And that this push will continue. Now, just to be clear, I'd actually love to see those numbers now because Inflation Reduction Act, right? US entering this clean energy race in a big way, $1 trillion of private money freed and so on, and or leveraged over the next few years. I wouldn't be surprised if that gap closed, or basically the US catching up, or maybe even usurping Europe here, in the sense that there's real money here and it's stable. It's not the whoops, Putin invaded Ukraine, stuff hitting the fan, let's go fast. Precisely because, if it all disappeared, gas starts flowing again, you may not see. Now, I don't think Europe is quite as myopic as that. I do think that there are permanent changes here in store, or broader, longer term changes. But still, policy is what matters ultimately, not the external factor of, COVID lockdown here and invasion over there.
Got you. And policies matter. And like you said, with Austria moving forward with a carbon tax, to be clear, Canada is also moving forward with an oil and gas emissions cap and still is hoping for the levitation trick of reducing the sector's emissions by about 80 megatons while not actually imposing or resulting in any kind of cap on production. We're waiting for the details, but it's a Herculean task. Let's get to questions. We've got a question from James Sterling. So James, over to you. Sorry, we may have surprised James because we pivoted very quickly. James, are you there? All right, I'm gonna read his question. So James asked, in the old days, a mantra of energy policy was to seek diversity of primary energy resource supply. It seems that Russian geopolitics led by a madman just reminds us of that wisdom. So how do we apply that wisdom to the energy transition? And list examples like gas versus renewables versus rare earth metals, etc. Sara, let's get you to take the first crack at that.
I think we're already seeing a push of, concern around this through, it certainly came through in the IRA and in the U.S. big climate policy that got passed. But, Canada, the U.S. and Australia, for example, have been working under a memorandum of understanding around access to critical metals and minerals for the last few years now. So I think there is, there is certainly a concern around the current state of concentration of these materials within, a very small number of countries, and of course the sort of hold that China has on some of the production. That said, I think I was actually just looking this morning at a map from, I think it was Bloomberg, of battery manufacturing facilities that have been announced, I believe, in the U.S. and Canada in just the last, I don't know, I want to say like the last 2 months, which is almost hard to imagine, but it was a very short time frame. And similarly, the push for development of some of the critical minerals like lithium and others, which also we have here in Canada and even here in Alberta. So I think there is a recognition of the concern around that. And I guess I think I'm pretty optimistic around the pace of action of dealing with that, right? I mean, obviously there's a big gap that has to be closed in terms of we aren't to date producing and manufacturing, very much at all of that stuff within, say, Canada or the US or sort of a broader, diverse set of countries. But that said, we're really still at the start of the large scale production of of electrification of personal transportation and stuff. So we're far behind in the current mix, but that current mix is a small amount of what we need to get to eventually. And I think there is, even aside from the war, I think coming out of COVID and really just a broader general sense of concern around globalization that's driving this. So I think it is very much top of mind for policymakers, and I think it very much can benefit, countries like Canada and provinces like Alberta that are going to be perhaps seeing a decrease over time in demand for hydrocarbons, and certainly a decrease in the price of those hydrocarbons, but have actually the potential to produce other materials that are also going to be needed.
Got you. In the interest of time and getting more questions in, Gernot and David, I'm going to cap it at Sara. Going back to James, sorry, we did not mean to mute you. We wanted to do the opposite, but we're happy at least to get your question out. We have Jen Turner, who's got a question, and we're going to try to unmute her. Over to you, Jen.
Oh, okay. Now I can unmute myself. Can you hear me?
We sure can. Yes.
Thank you so much for this event and taking my question. So my question is pretty broad, but I think it's kind of an important one. I've read a bunch, like after the recent, well, I guess there's Crimea, but in the face of, recent events in Ukraine, I've gone through reports and, gone through a lot of these conversations and conferences. And I've noticed that there's a lot of rallying on climate, but it's kind of backwards engineered. Everybody agrees where we need to arrive. But in a lot of the reports, I noticed that there wasn't really a lot of focus on the need to avoid conflict or instability. So I wanted to ask you as experts, do you think that plans to achieve climate targets are properly considering these risks, like the need to avoid conflict, like the need to avoid instability? And I guess now we're already seeing some right-leaning governments rise up in response to recent events, right? So do you consider this to be another form of climate risk? And if so, how can we do better in terms of our plans to go forward?
Jen, that's a great question. And yeah, we're seeing this trend of right-leaning governments and anti-climate governments as well, and pointing to these kinds of shocks. Gernot, I'd love to get your take on that question, on Jen's question.
Right. So I think there's two aspects. So, right. So there's the demand and the supply, right? So on demand, demand for policy, right? And yeah, we do see that. I mean, we haven't talked about the UK at all here, as no longer part of the EU. And that's another hour of discussion, right? What's happening there right now, and the retrenchment and so on climate policy. They have bigger problems right now. They're not even talking about that, right? So yes, absolutely. I would say on the sort of the geopolitics and well, maybe the short version is there is a huge difference here between being dependent on commodities, where the day-to-day flow matters, right? You pay for, versus, frankly, right, the lean, clean future we all want, right? The renewables, right? So, yeah, you get the solar panel with the rare earth metal, and you don't like the regime that mined the rare earth metal. But once you have the solar panel, you have the solar panel, right? You're not dependent on them anymore, right? So there's a huge difference here on the supply side, where basically, if Russia can use energy as an instrument of war because the stuff needs to flow on a daily basis. Can China use energy as an instrument of war because we are buying their solar panels and batteries and wind turbines? I mean, up to a point. Yeah, but for the solar panels you bought, you got them, you have them, right? You're producing the electricity now for free once you paid for it, right? You're no longer getting another solar panel if that's your dependence on a supply chain, right? But there's a very different geopolitics here of renewables, including rare earth mining, versus commodities like oil, gas, and coal.
Okay, David, over to you, and then I've got something to say too.
Great question, Jennifer. I think the answer is agreeing on very long-term targets is easy because it's not that real. The thing that's hard is actually agreeing on near-term policies that have real trade-offs and costs. And I do think that I think you're correct in your implication that there's not enough thinking to the security implications of transition. And what Gernot said about solar panels is correct. But in alternative views of what will happen, where maybe a lot of those solar panels will be installed, say, in North Africa to supply Europe by undersea cables, because the capacity factor is so much higher in North Africa than Europe, then, though it's still true that, as Gernot said, that once you build the solar panel, you don't need more rare earths to maintain that solar panel. You have different but analogous dynamics about who gets the resource rents and colonialism and the hard politics of energy that you did with oil exports. I think that just because we're moving to a low carbon, renewables, or in my view, nuclear future, doesn't mean we're moving to a future where magically we don't have sharp governance challenges from unequal distribution of these resources.
Yeah, and I'll
jump in and go help my mom.
So, okay, thanks, David. And I'll jump in. The solar panels is a great example of policy conflict that you can get, where you have, say, a climate policy. In Canada, we want to decarbonize our grid further than it already is decarbonized. And to do that, we're building out and supporting utility scale solar developments. And for that, the cheapest panels on the planet are using cells manufactured in China, if not the panels themselves. And those cells then, if you have issues with China, are then sent to East Asia, to Malaysia, Vietnam, wherever, and then they're assembled into panels. So you want those panels to come in and you want to build utility scale solar, but at the same time, you don't want China driving your domestic solar manufacturers out of business through dumping their products. And increasingly now, you want to ensure that there is not forced labor involved in the manufacturing of those solar panels. and that you're propping up terrible a terrible domestic treatment of minorities like the Uyghurs in China. So you get that conflict, and can you trust within a country one side to be talking to the other and to resolve the conflict? From my experience, the answer is no. You just have the conflict, and stakeholders like renewable energy developers in Canada are caught in the middle and don't know what to do. Sara, I want to turn to you. We've hit the top of the hour. We've lost David. We've already used lots of Gernot's time. Maybe a quick hit from you, and then any kind of concluding thoughts you have.
Yeah, I mean, just picking up on the excellent answers to that question, I think to me, it boils down to this idea that, everything that we do has an impact, and it's all about everything, everything, certainly when we produce and consume energy. And so, first off, it's how do we do less of that? How do we use less energy? And then how do we understand the relative impacts of different choices and balance those impacts as well as the costs behind those? And the part I think that I put forward as a challenge and, really ties back to this conversation that we've been having, which I think shows that the situation in Europe stemming from this illegal invasion of Ukraine is incredibly complex. And one of the problems, of course, as always, is that it gets boiled down in sound bites and within politics, especially into these very, very short, oh, well, the price of gas is up, therefore we should get rid of the, whoever is in power today. And I think that we're only going to really be able to address these issues if we can dig down at least a few steps below that, but also if we can start thinking about how, coming back to the very beginning where Gernot was talking about the, how did we get there, this sort of like myopic focus on the lowest cost as the only thing around which we end up optimizing, can be beneficial in the very short term, maybe, but can lead to a lot of problems down the road. And so making sure that we're, not tempted by that as sort of the only guiding light when we're designing our energy and climate policies.
Okay, thanks, Sara. And a big thank you to Gernot. Listen, this is a very weighty, sprawling conversation with huge implications. We needed someone who has a great sense of what's going on and has that stake, being from Europe himself. Let's not understate the importance of that to come in and help us make sense of it. You did a great job, and we're really, really grateful.
Thank you. This was fun.
All right. So a reminder that this episode is going to be available at energyversusclimate.com and on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. Please review and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. This helps us to find new listeners, to help new listeners find the show. And feel free anytime to send us feedback to info@energyversusclimate.com. So we'll be back at the end of October with a podcast-only episode. Sorry, live audience. It's going to be an update on U.S. policy, and particularly in light of what we mentioned earlier, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the huge implications that it has for clean energy development in the U.S. We're excited. That's going to feature Catherine Hamilton, formerly of the Energy Gang podcast, as a special guest, helping us to make sense of it. So check it out and make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform and at energyversusclimate.com to be notified when it's available. You won't want to miss that one too. And a big thanks to Hannah Tai, to Priya Kunikolato, to Crystal Hickey, and to our tireless producer, Eva Voinigescu, for all their support. Thanks, everyone, and see you next time.